Hello again. In this video clip, we're looking at clause 4.4 of ISO 9001, Quality Management System and its processes. It's conveniently separated into two subclauses. The first one, the primary criteria, reads as follows. The organization shall establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve a quality management system, including the processes needed for their interactions in accordance with the requirements of this international standard. That alone, I suppose, has its own intent. I suppose what ISO really wants any organization to do is to get you to specify the overarching requirements for the management system. So you're going to have procedures, all kinds of policies, different kinds of controls and so on put in place, which amounts to a management system. And at this clause, what we're looking to do is establish, well, what are the processes and what are the policies and procedures and the documentation effectively that's required to support the management system. And the second part of the clause takes through a lot of detail. So this will give you an understanding of what an auditor will expect. So the organization shall determine the processes needed for the quality management system and their application throughout the organization. That's important. It's how they're applied. Yeah, looking into the criteria, it gives us a bit more direction. A, determine the inputs required and the outputs expected from these processes. Those of you who are watching who are familiar with the Enable ISO Total Management System, we use a TMS registers, which in there we've got a number of ways to document information related to processes. We have the process risk register, which documents the processes in linear sequential order and provides for a lot of the criteria that we're about to discuss. But one of the things that it does certainly ask is to document the expected outcome of each activity within a process. At this stage, though, really what we're looking to do is establish things at a high enough level. So we're not looking at the meticulous detail. So the resourcing register that we use within the TMS registers, that's key to the management system because it's there you would document the requirements or the inputs into the process. And having said that, at this stage, it's really understanding, referring back to the video clip we looked at for the scope statement. And we would start off there, identifying the processes, documenting them a high level description at that stage. And then into the resourcing register, we look at the inputs. I guess, let's look at the further details. Determine the sequence and the interaction of these processes. So you've heard me mention the process risk register. In effect, what we're doing there is we're using a spreadsheet to document the processes in linear sequential order. We could use a table in a Word document. We could use, a prose type procedure document, old-fashioned SOPs. But there are no requirements for that type of document within ISO for 9001. Essentially, we need to make sure that we have the processes documented so that the sequence and the interaction of the processes, as per clause subclause B here, and it's a direct response rather than a prosal type of approach. Part C is determine and apply the criteria and methods, including monitoring, measurements, and related performance indicators, needed to ensure the effective operation and control of these processes. That's quite broad. We're talking about, if there are 8 or 10 key processes included in the management system, for each one of those, we need to look at each of the process activities in linear sequential order and determine for each activity, where do we need to monitor? Where are the critical failure points? Where are the bits that matter for the effective outcome? So there might be a number of points along the way before the process is complete, where there are milestones, if you like, for quality control or periodic checks at various points in the process. What needs to be monitored and measured. What are the indicators that people need to be monitoring and benchmarking against? So it's really the critical criteria. And there's a qualifier that comes later on in the clause, which we'll look at, and will help us to give us a bit of guidance with regard to the level of detail. In the meantime, let's move on. Determine the resources needed for these processes and ensure their availability. We're looking ahead a little bit because the resourcing register, again, which we introduce in clause 7, essentially this will cater for some of the criteria here, but I guess at this management clause end, it's determining how we're going to do that is more to answer the point. So the resourcing register will come into play there, and so too will the process risk register, which we'll look at in some more detail in a separate clip. The part E here is assign the responsibilities and authorities for these processes. So yes, there's a couple of layers that we need to consider here, because the responsibilities and authorities for the processes, it's easy to think of these being at management level, but the responsibility for a process might lie with the operator of a machine or the driver of a van, for example. So it's not necessarily somebody who's at top management or supervisory level. F, address the risks and opportunities as determined in accordance with these requirements of 6.1. Now, obviously, we haven't looked at 6.1 yet. Essentially, that's the area where we determine the actions required to address risks and opportunities. At this stage, there's really just looking for the organization to establish the processes for addressing risks and opportunities, and to make sure that that falls within the scope of the management system as documented information. G, evaluate these processes and implement any changes needed to ensure that these processes achieve their intended results. From a clausal perspective, when we're looking at a management clause like clause 4, and really it's to establish a mechanism for how evaluation is to take place. Safe to say that customers of Enable ISO who are using the total management system, you will have in place a combination of sheets within the TMS registers, which help us to address the requirements here. Let me just scroll a little further down to capture the next bit of criteria. H, improve the processes and the quality management system. It's one of the primary criteria, and one of the things that draws me to ISO in the first instance is the requirement for an organization to continually seek improvement. Well, this is where we're stating it at high level. We need to at this stage establish a process for improving the management system and improve the processes within it. So yeah, it's provided for within the TMS registers, but the intent here really is to provide a framework for how this might happen, and to provide it as how we're going to document that within the system. And two things that are worth commenting on here at this stage. First of all, the TMS registers provides for inputs into a process. So if you think of the 5 M's, manpower, materials, machinery, methodology, and the mother nature one, environment, for the operational processes. Well, manpower inputs into a process. We will look at that in detail under clause 7. For the resourcing of processes, we have to look at the people that are required for the operation. The materials end of it, well, inputs into the process where materials are important, and we deal with a lot of customers where they don't have material inputs as such, more speaking toward infrastructure and so on, but the material inputs into a process need to be considered. The machinery and equipment and infrastructure, if you like, needs to be considered, partly between the machinery and environment, we'll consider infrastructure, because environment and infrastructure could mean controlling the environment using, you know, utilities and equipment like machinery for air conditioning and ventilation and so on. I guess you know, the whole area of competency will be looked at as well as an input into the process, and knowledge later on in clause 7. So it's safe to say at this stage we're just looking for how we're going to document this stuff. Clause 442 as a subclause, it's the simplest, it's very straightforward. And I'll look at the words of the criteria in a moment, but A and B, part A, the organization shall maintain documented information to support the operation of its processes. And B, retain documented information to have confidence that the processes are being carried out as planned. I guess what we're being asked to do here is very straightforward. And first of all, you know, establish documentation as per clause 441 and maintain it to support the operation of its processes. So we're talking about process instruction, and particularly information about where the responsibilities for particular tasks within processes lie, who has the authority to proceed in the event of something going wrong, and where are accountabilities. This, you know, particularly when you're thinking health and safety, accountabilities, information security, there are accountabilities there in law. So where do they lie? And you know, when we're saying the supporting information, we also have to include whatever we consider, as mentioned earlier on from clause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. So the caveat here, the qualifier is in 442, where it says to the extent necessary, and that's the most important phrase in this criteria. It's up for the organization. In fact, let me just read from my notes here. And this is from the interpretation of clause 4.4 from the ISO FAQ section of the website. It says, the organization retains the authority, accountability, and autonomy to decide how it will fulfill the management system requirements, including the level of detail and the extent to which it will integrate the management system requirements into its business. So, yes, to the extent necessary means quite a bit. But the caveat is you have to be able to demonstrate that you've gone to the extent necessary with the documentation and the information that you provide to support the operation. So I guess there's a simple principle here that we can summarize with: to the extent necessary can be largely explained by considering this rule of thumb. And there's a wonderful thing called the cup of tea principle, right? So if we're talking about a complex engineering operation where there are numerous prescribed methodologies and KPIs that have to be met within the process, but the person who's employed to carry out the process has a super duper doctorate in whatever the activity is, to them, you know, describing the process in a lot of detail, well, to them, it's the equivalent of making a cup of tea. So to the extent necessary applies to the competency and experience of the individual carrying out the work, because there's no point in explaining to them in detail the complexity of a detailed process when to them they know it inside out, they're doing it every day 1,000 times over. You don't need to explain it to them because it's just part of their very, you know, automated way of doing things now. So you can demonstrate that you've met the extent when you have a high level or light touch approach, and that's perfectly acceptable, so long as you can substantiate that with, you know, demonstrating that the people carrying out the work have huge amount of experience or competency in relation to doing the task. And the task might be a very straightforward one, and we can't ignore that. A lot of work is, some people might call it boring, other people call it straightforward or simplistic. So it might be that really and truly there's no need to support the operation with information, because it's the type of activity which, once you show a person how to do it once, that's it, they've got it forever. So yes, to the extent necessary, but make sure that you're able to support that with reality and fact on the ground. Okay, that's it for now. Though it's important that you keep in mind that the total management system that we use, further video clips will take this clause and show how that system is applied to respond to the clause. So yeah, keep going, keep working, and it's another step towards certification. Thank you very much for now. Take care.